very warm welcome, Your Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, friends, partners, colleagues, everyone. Welcome to the British Library, where I have the great pleasure of being Chief Executive, and welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
There is a sense of intense homecoming as we return, even though virtually, to JLF in London. It's been a huge privilege to partner with the British Library, and this collaboration has been so full of joy and learning.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched, and it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
This is the first time I've been to it in London. I've been to the one in Rajasthan before, and it's fantastic. It's got a different vibe here, but it's equally wonderful here.
JLF brings this amazing festival to London. It's a wonderful get-together of writers and thinkers, and you know, I only go to one festival, literature festival in the world, and it's this one.
The people who've been here, both bookshop customers, the authors and the organisers, have been an absolute delight to work with. I can honestly say as well that this is the best dressed, most elegantly dressed crowd at any literary festival I've ever seen anywhere.
It's maintained the standards which I'm accustomed to in Jaipur itself, and I'm extremely happy to be part of it here.
I love this festival. I think it's a privilege for me.
JLF deserves enormous congratulation for the way that it puts its program together here. I think that all of the events are superbly chaired. I think that the setting here in the British Library is just a fantastic environment.
Welcome back to JLF London 2020 at the British Library, presented in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation UK and our patrons, the Murthy Family Foundation. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. We really love for you to consider donating to help us with JLF London at the British Library by clicking on the donation link below. Our next session is Tharoorosaurus, Shashi Tharoor in conversation with James Crabtree. Writer, diplomat, politician, and public intellectual Shashi Tharoor and his unerring sense of humor lightens up the serious oeuvre of his work, which includes a powerful indictment of colonialism. His predilection for long words and telling phrases has also created a subgenre of Tharoorisms. In conversation with journalist and author James Crabtree, Tharoor speaks of his latest book, Tharoorosaurus, and shares some whimsical stories and interesting anecdotes behind his vocabulary. He also speaks of the beliefs and ideas that have anchored him in his public life and literary career. Shashi Tharoor is an author, politician, and former international civil servant. Dr. Tharoor is the award-winning author of over 20 books of fiction and non-fiction. He is currently serving a third term in India's parliament, representing the Thiruvananthapuram constituency, where he was elected with a record margin of votes. He's previously served as Minister of State for Human Resource Development and Minister of State for External Affairs in the Government of India. He currently chairs the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology. During his nearly 3 decades long prior career at the United Nations, he served as a peacekeeper, refugee worker, and administrator at the highest levels serving as Under Secretary General during Kofi Annan's leadership of the organization. His books of fiction and non-fiction include The Great Indian Novel, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, The Hindu Way, and The New World Disorder. He's won numerous literary awards, including a Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the prestigious Crossword Lifetime Achievement Award, and the Sahitya Academy Award in the category of English non-fiction for his book, An Era of Darkness. James Crabtree is a Singapore-based author and journalist and an associate professor of practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. His best-selling 2018 book, The Billionaire Raj, A Journey Through India's New Gilded Age, was shortlisted for the FT McKinsey Book of the Year. Remember, our sessions are available to view on londonjlflitfest.org and on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And should you drop off due to bandwidth issues, and if you're in India, of course you can blame Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who's on the Parliamentary Standing Committee. Otherwise, you can just log back onto Facebook. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section below. And those questions James will pose of Shashi at the end of the session. We thank Lonchura, our podcast partner, for this session. Ladies and gentlemen, Tharoorosaurus, Shashi Tharoor in conversation with James Crabtree.
You see, the whole country of the system is juxtapositioned by the hemoglobin in the atmosphere because he is just a sophisticated rhetorician intoxicated by the exuberance of his own vocabulary.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this conversation about the Tharoorosaurus, the new book from Shashi Tharoor, who I'm delighted to have joining me here this evening. I'm in Singapore. Shashi is somewhere in India. He'll tell us where in a minute.
New Delhi. Parliament starts tomorrow.
Very good. And so his new book is a canter through 53 unusual words from the beginning word, Agatha Cacological, through to Zugzwang, by way of all sorts of others that we'll touch on. Shashi, just for those who haven't read this or haven't heard of it, where did the idea come from? And also at the beginning, you dedicate the book to your father, and you say that your love of words partly began very early in life through him. And I wonder if you'd be kind enough to tell us a little bit about that, and in a sense where everybody knows who you are and your love of language, but it'd be interesting to hear where this came from personally.
Thank you. Well, the idea for the book came from the publisher, I have to admit. Meru Gokhale, the publisher of Penguin India. We were in the back seat of a taxi cab in Jaipur heading to the literary festival that's hosting this event. When she said, listen, you know, I had acquired a bit of notoriety as people living outside India would not necessarily know for using words that initially I thought were commonplace and turned out to be obscure when I denounced a rather offensive television journalist as spouting a farrago of distortions, misrepresentations, and outright lies. Apparently, it sparked such a search for farrago from Indian Twitterati that there were 1 million searches on the Oxford English Dictionary site, prompting the OED to issue a tweet wondering why on earth this had happened. Why were 1 million Indians wanting to know what farrago meant? And that sort of started, I thought, an undeserved reputation. After all, I'd like to think of myself as somebody who communicates, and the purpose of communication is to be understood. So no one communicates well by using words people can't understand. But once I was saddled with this reputation, it became very difficult to shake off, and I decided to play on the joke. So, for example, when I published my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, in announcing its release, I didn't just say my book is out. I said, this book is more than just a 500-page exercise in floxy nosi nihilipilification, which was, of course, a way of pulling my own leg, and at the same time, sparking interest and curiosity in the book, which is precisely the effect it had. So what Meru wanted to do was to capitalize on all of this and do Tharoorosaurus, pitching me a book whose title would combine my name, Tharoor, with the word Tyrannosaurus, and so many are terrified of difficult words, and Thesaurus, since of course people want to be able to look them up. I laughed it off then, she persisted, and I began to think it might be fun to do after all. And this is the result. And it just came out on the 1st of September in India, but it actually sort of reached the top 10 of the Amazon lists in India just during pre-order stage. There seems to be an amazing amount of curiosity about all this. And the truth is, I'm not a scholar. I'm not a trained linguist. I'm not a philologist. I have no pretension. And I've loved them all my life, and it's basically because of my father, which is why I've dedicated the book to him, because he was obsessed with it. He went to a Malayalam medium village school, went to England at age 19, and essentially crash coursed his way into becoming proficient in English. Self-taught. I found after his death notebooks of Byron and Shakespeare that he'd copied out in order to get used to the feel and the sounds of the words. He absolutely was obsessed with word games. He played Scrabble, he played bingo, he made up games that kept the whole family busy and distracted on car journeys throughout his life. For example, he would imagine a 5-letter word, and we had to guess it in 20 tries by coming up with other 5-letter words and being told how many letters matched. So we'd be deducing through the letters what the word might be. No definitions given, nothing. It's an extraordinary game, and I would recommend it warmly to others. Anyway, so all of these things, so he delighted in the way in which words could be put together, their origins, the letters of which they're made. He was a Scrabble fanatic, which, by the way, has gone down the family tree as a result of him. He now has a grandson in California who excels at Scrabble. And all of this meant that words became for us a source of pleasure and delight. It never was a chore. It never was homework. It was never something we felt we had to study. It was fun. It was entertainment. It was escape. And that love, that sort of pleasure, delight, joy in words is something that I hope I've tried to communicate in this rather light-hearted book. The 52 words are real words, and not all of them are terribly obscure, but they all have interesting stories around them. So, and some, once in a while, I venture out on a limb that I once wrote a piece somewhere that said that I immodestly thought I might have invented the word prepone. And I got a very sweet email from the chief editor of the OED assuring me that prepone had already been tried out in a letter to an American newspaper editor a century before me. A century ago, which was about 40 years before I thought I'd done it, and so on. But I have stuck my neck out and think that all the word origin buffs have got goon wrong, and that it really comes from the Hindi gunda. And I'm willing to roll up my sleeves and fight with somebody for it.
Very good. Well, you've got 53 words. I went through and figured, I think that about 24 or 25 of them I'd never heard before. So I felt like I was batting a pretty poor average. You better tell people what flocky knocky
don't feel bad
means.
Sorry, don't feel bad, because there's a story told of the notorious Indian nationalist Krishna Menon, who was our first High Commissioner in London, and he was complimented. Some poor, unfortunate Englishwoman, you probably know who she is, Bridget Brophy, most unfortunately congratulated him on his English, complimented him on his English, and he looked at her and said, "Madam, my English is much better than yours. I learned it. You merely picked it up." Which I think is essentially the problem the English have. They assume it's their language because they've been speaking it since birth, or since they could speak. But the rest of us have taken a little more trouble over acquiring it. Now, forgive me, I interrupted you when you were asking a question. Which word did you want me to explain?
You use flocky knocky nihilification, and you didn't explain what it meant. So I think for our audience, if you're going to use some of these words, you better at least tell people what they mean.
Fair enough. Floxinosi nihilipilification was made up by a bunch of undergraduates in the 19th century, I think. It was essentially a way of taking up a number of letters that have to do with nothingness. And nihil, obviously, is one that most people would realize. And putting them all together to create a fake word that then passed into the language and has even been used quite recently in the House of Commons. It essentially means the act of estimating something or someone as worthless. Because if you look at what it's made of, it includes fluxus in Latin, which is a wisp, naucum, which is a trifle, nihilum, which is nothing, pilus is a hair, and fication. So you imagine a wisp, a trifle, nothingness, and a hair. Fication will give you the longest regular word in the English language, being one letter longer than the traditionally cited anti-disestablishmentarianism. And so this word, I think it was Jacob Rees-Mogg who used it in the British House of Commons to rail against European Union judges. I have the exact quote in the book. "I'm glad to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the requirement not to be rude about judges applies only to judges in this country. It does not apply to judges in the EU, so let me be rude about them. Let me indulge in the floxinosi nihilipilification of EU judges." There you are.
So let me pick you up on what you said earlier. You were talking about the act of being a politician and the fact that you can't communicate using words that nobody understands. You had an interesting back and forth on Twitter today with Chetan Bhagat, the Indian author, in which you praised him for the simplicity of his language. And I wonder, how do you sort of manage this tension in your own public life between your love of language and fancy words and the need for a politician to speak plainly?
Well, it's interesting, James, because very early in my political career, I suffered from not speaking very clearly, in the sense that early on in Twitter, a journalist of BJP leanings, I might add, and therefore not particularly friendly, reacted to an austerity drive declared by my government with a tweet to me saying, "So, Mr. Minister, does this mean you will travel in cattle class?" So I replied, since he'd used the phrase, and I knew the phrase, having just come to India after 35 years abroad, where it's common usage, as you know, for the airlines who herd economy class passengers in like cattle, I replied, "Yes, in cattle class, out of solidarity with all our holy cows." And believe me, the dung hit the fan. It became the front page news of the country for 3 days, as people accused a Congress party minister of being insufferably elitist and disparaging all economy class passengers as cattle. And as you know, the expression has nothing to do with disparaging economy class passengers. It has to do with disparaging the airlines. But no one wanted to listen. It got even worse when it was translated into multiple Indian languages and Indian media. And so I realized quickly the wisdom of Shakespeare's old warning way back in the end of the 16th century, that the success of a jest lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. That is, don't use words, however good and noble your intentions might be, don't use words that people might misunderstand. And in politics particularly, people are all too willing to misunderstand because others will actually stir them up to do so. So I learned a very hard lesson that way. Politically, in my own constituency in Kerala, I campaign in Malayalam, and my Malayalam is much more rudimentary than my English, and therefore I don't end up having to say things that are too difficult for my voters to understand. In fact, usually I say things so simple that even a child can understand, which is why it's a pity for me that children don't have the vote, because I might actually win even more large, handsome majorities in Thiruvananthapuram if children could vote. But jokes apart, the tension, therefore, is not a political tension, and that politically I'm careful to choose very simple, clear words. It's a fact that I also have this other life as a writer, or Sanjoy called me at the beginning a public intellectual, whatever that means, and therefore I do write and books, articles, columns, expressing opinions in writing. And when I am expressing my opinions, I choose the words that I consider most appropriate for them, and they may not always be the easiest words for people to understand. Anyway, today, Chetan Bhagat, who is the opposite of me, he's often held up and cited as somebody, if Shashi Tharoor is seen as difficult to read, Chetan Bhagat is easy to read. Chetan is a friend of mine. He openly says that he is happy to write books in English for people who don't know English very well, small town people who are for whom English is a second language, who read English really for aspirational reasons. But he has a good story to tell, and they buy his books. He's a best-selling writer. His books are only published in paperback. There's no hardback, Bhagat, because they go straight into a million copies. Because he writes for people in parts of the country who are not used or not welcoming of my kind of English, and that's an entirely legitimate thing for him to do. But he then branched out a few years ago into writing a weekly opinion column. For a while, he seemed to have drunk the Modi Kool-Aid. And so many of us on my side of the political aisle, the more liberal side, as we'd call ourselves, were obviously critical of much of what he had to say. But his merit he always had was he expressed himself with great clarity and simplicity. I mean, literally, somebody for whom English is not their first language would have no difficulty understanding what Chetan is saying and the terms in which he's expressing it. There are no great complexities in his ideas. He describes things with very simple, homely analogies, very simple language. And today he wrote a column. I think he's finally recovered from his Modi infatuation. And without attacking the Modi government, he actually attacked a number of the failings of that government in terms of their decisions on economic policy, on the management of the coronavirus, on their destruction of social cohesion in a famously diverse society by promulgating religious hatred. And he did so in very simple, no-nonsense language. You can imagine him saying this to you in a living room conversation. And so I wrote praising him and telling him that I was actually very impressed by this column. I didn't tell him, I told the readers. I said, a superb piece by Chetan Bhagat on all that ails our country and what we should do about it. And then I went on to say, Chetan's great virtue is the simplicity and directness of his writing. His message is clear, and I hope his fans in the government act on it. Now, to my surprise, Chetan then reacted with gushing joy at being praised by me, and it wasn't sarcastic. He actually was very touched. He actually wrote to me privately as well to tell me how grateful he was. And then he issued another tweet saying, okay, I still can't get over this. There Shashi Tharoor has praised Chetan Bhagat. I'm floating. And then he added mischievously, just one request, sir. Next time, can you use some big words to praise me like the ones only you can do? Superb is nice, but a big one would really make my day. So that was really an invitation I could not resist. And so I replied, sure, Chetan Bhagat, it's clear you're not sesquipedalian, nor given to rhodomontade. Your ideas are unembellished with tortuous convolutions and expressed without ostentation. I appreciate the limpid perspicacity of today's column. I mean, it was obviously tongue firmly in cheek, James, and you fully realize that. But in the 2 hours since that tweet was issued, it has had nearly 30,000 likes on Twitter, and it's been retweeted 7,000 times, and 3,500 people have replied to it. And I'm just going, oh my God, you know, but there we are. I was just having a good time.
So since you're talking about politics, let's talk about politics for a minute. In the words that you've chosen, so your 53 words, there's a bunch that are more commonly used that in a sense reflect the spirit of the political times in India. So you have troll, vigilante, curfew. You also accuse Mr. Modi of running a kakistocracy, which you'd better explain.
Sure.
But I suppose I wondered if you could reflect a minute on what the ascendancy of the BJP and Mr. Modi mean for the politics of the English language in India, and in a sense whether English as a medium of communication is becoming less central to Indian public life as you have the rise of the kind of Hindi-speaking Hindu nationalism across the country.
Well, that's a very, very fair question, James, because English was always a minority language in India. And at the same time, it was the language that set the national political agenda. In other words, the more important debates in Parliament were in English, the major newspapers that actually laid out political discourse in this country are English language newspapers. The major television channels on which politicians appear were English language television channels. And all of these essentially occurred, it seems to me, despite the fact that they were only aiming at a very small section of society. And it was justified, I would say, on two grounds. The less important is the fact that, in fact, in every society, a small minority really is very interested in politics and focuses on that. And therefore, that minority in India that's English speaking is a smaller, it's not as small a minority when you put them against the minority of those interested in political ideas and issues. But the more important issue is that, of course, the merit English has in India is that it's understood everywhere. It's understood by few people everywhere, but it's understood everywhere. And as a result, it doesn't divide the nation linguistically. A political argument made by, say, a Tamil-speaking finance minister in English resonates in Hindi-speaking North India as well, and a stirring speech has happened, for example, after 26/11, when we had the horrible Mumbai attack. The Prime Minister addressed the nation. His mother tongue is Punjabi. He was educated in Urdu. He spoke to the nation in English. So that sort of thing was the contradiction inherent in the use of English in Indian politics, until the Modi government's ascendancy in the last 6 years, which has transformed the idiom of politics. First of all, because the Modi government is a populist government. They want to show the world that they represent, if you like, a section of the populace that is not particularly comfortable in the English language. Mr. Modi himself is not comfortable in English and prefers to express himself in Hindi. And of course, in his home state, in his mother tongue, Gujarati, but otherwise in Hindi. Most of his ministers not only speak Hindi as their language of choice, but in something that's unprecedented in terms of Indian parliamentary convention, most of them reply to questions asked in English in Hindi. Which, I mean, there was an unwritten convention for 70 odd years that if an MP, particularly one from the southern part of India, where Hindi is not just unfamiliar, but in some parts even anathema, were to speak in English, you owe him the courtesy of a reply in English. And it so happens that ministers have stopped feeling they are bothered about that today. So that is also a change. Then you've got the situation, James, where the population has also grown dramatically in Hindi-speaking India, and less so in non-Hindi-speaking India. The South is actually witnessing a gradual decline in population, and certainly in relation to the North, it's a complete decline. So the result is that the dominance of Hindi as the language of political discourse is now more and more entrenched. It is said, for example, that you cannot be a successful politician in India, cannot be Prime Minister of India, cannot be a leader of the opposition without being able to make fluent demotic speeches in Hindi to mass audiences and mobilize voters and support in the Hindi-speaking part of the country. It is also said that the votes of the Hindi speakers will now determine the future of India. And to compound all of this, the BJP represents an ideology often summed up in the phrase Hindi, Hindutva, Hindustan. They see a monolithic India, one language, one nationhood, and one religious identity, and they do seem to want to thrust that upon a society that has been astonishingly diverse. So all of this comes in to a proper answer to your question, because this emphasis on uniformity and conformity, rather than unity and consensus, which were very different faces of the same impulsion for unity, this is very much driving divides into our society. So my using English is not just the fact that I'm a southern politician who happens to be more comfortable in English anyway than in Hindi, though I can, unlike many of my southern MPs, I can speak Hindi reasonably fluently, and I do give interviews in the language. Nonetheless, English is by far my language of choice, and it's the language in which I write. So as an author, it's the language in which I publish my books. And it's not just because of that. It's also to make the point that English has a place as an instrument of Indian unity that this government should not and cannot afford to overlook.
Let me ask one other question before we go over to, we're going to take a few questions from the audience. So if you, wherever you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can leave questions in the chat function, and we'll take a couple of those for Shashi. But one other theme I noticed throughout the 53 words was that a number of them, you pick words where the English words have an Indian origin. So this is well known from Hobbs and Jobson. You mentioned thug already. The one I liked was juggernaut, which I'd never heard of having an Indian. You even mentioned namaste. I mean, could you reflect for a minute, in a sense, how you think India itself will change the English language as India continues to rise and its global influence expands over the coming decades and centuries ahead?
Interesting you should put it that way, James. In fact, the Indian languages had far more of an impact on the English language in the past. That is, when the British were ruling, a lot more Indian words directly went into the English language. So it's not, for example, loot. I have mischievously written that the British took the word, the Hindi word loot, into their dictionaries as well as their habits. But it also included some of the words that you've mentioned. And at the same time, it involved the British acquiring or creating a slang that came out of their first-hand experience. So, for example, a common English slang expression in the first half of the 19th century, in fact, most of the 19th century, for a bit of a fuss and a to-do was Dulali. It came from the town of Devlali, and presumably some soldier had found Devlali a very fancy town, and so a big do must have taken place there, a banquet of some sort. And so the British, you'll find 19th century novels in Britain, set in Britain, where people talk about having a Dulali. Now, that's gone out of the English language. But loot has remained. Juggernaut has remained. Juggernaut even precedes British colonialism, because it actually, it has a kind of vaguely Germanic look. It looks like Junker or something, Juggernaut or something like that, but it's not. It's actually from the name of the deity, the Hindu deity Jagannath, who's carried in a devotional procession, and an English traveler, Sir John Mandeville, in the 14th century described that festival with a grotesque error. He saw apparently somebody being trampled to death under the wheels of the chariot, and decided that it meant that people were throwing themselves as a religious sacrifice. There is, in fact, no tradition of religious sacrifice of that nature in Hinduism, and he saw the person to death and said that this must be because of the remorseless, relentless, all-consuming force of this chariot, and called it a juggernaut. And that became, by the 18th century in English, a synonym for an irresistible and destructive force that demands total devotion or unforgiving sacrifice. And it popped up in the novels of Charlotte Bronte and Charles Dickens, and Robert Louis Stevenson used it for Mr. Hyde in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And of course, it's become metaphorical now as something remorseless, implacable, unstoppable, all of that, but also demanding blind devotion and absolute sacrifice. I suppose its synonyms are words like steamroller and battering ram. But you can use it more benignly. Who can stop the Federer juggernaut at Wimbledon? I saw a headline not too long ago, or last year. Or people talk about the Obama electoral juggernaut and so on. But the fact is that poor old Lord Jagannath was actually a very kindly god, and millions of worshippers in Puri will tell you that Lord Jagannath is a figure of reverence, not of fear. Now, I've sidestepped your question, will India have more of an influence? I'm not sure, because I think that what's happened with the globalization of the English language is also, in fact, a greater willingness now to actually accept that there are multiple variants of it. So I think Indian English will be seen as something different from English, rather than something to be infused into English, rather like American, rather like Australian, and so on. I think you will find that Indian English will be recognized as a distinctive form of English, rather than something that brings new words in very much. Nonetheless, I put it in namaste because the popularity of the namaste greeting during the coronavirus. And Satyagraha has an interesting story. Mahatma Gandhi coined it through an English language newspaper in South Africa. He conducted a public competition to find a word better than the word that English language journalists were using to describe his civil disobedience campaigns, which was passive resistance. He said, nothing passive about my resistance. If you want to fight for truth, you have to fight actively for it. So let's find another word. And it was the readers of an English language newspaper who, coming up from these Sanskrit roots, came up with satyagraha. So you see that it's not impossible that new such words can be coined, and perhaps will be. But the English language has the wonderful quality of flexibility, absorptiveness, and willingness to accommodate. So you may yet turn out to be right.
Very good. Well, look, you're bang on time, so we've got 10 minutes for questions. Let's start with a fun one, and I want to add in my own here. So one of your words was, you're not normally as a politician given to admitting weakness, but one of your words was lethologica, the act of being at a loss for the right word. And I wondered, you claim that this strikes you from time to time, but it doesn't seem very likely. And on the same vein, Rohita asks, being such a master of words, have you ever been gobsmacked by a word in your life? So are you truly lost for words ever? And have you ever been gobsmacked by a particular word?
Well, I was gobsmacked as recently as yesterday when I was asked to address a webinar on political polarization in India. And somebody said, please address the phenomenon of pacification. And I said, what? Do you mean pacification? He said, no, pacification. And it turned out to be a real word. It was coined by a Guardian correspondent, I think, about a decade ago, to refer, sorry, not even a decade ago, in about 2015, to refer to what happened. To what happened to the Greek political party PASOK, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement, which got squeezed from both the left and the right, and went overnight in one election from being the largest party in the Greek parliament with 163 seats to, in the next election, being the smallest party with 13 seats. And that's PASOKification, because it lost its credibility as a socialist party, and Syriza came up. And of course, it was already hit from the right because of its socialist policies. And so pacification is what this person was interested in seeing me discuss. I'm afraid in the context of my own party, the Congress Party, and I don't think it's happening to Congress. But it may have happened, for example, to the Scottish Labour Party. So it's not exactly an unusual word. It's a word that will probably be more and more used in political discourse. So that's one I was gobsmacked with. But lethologica does happen to everyone. I mean, you have this awful feeling when you think of a word that you know well and convey, and then suddenly while you're speaking, the word just doesn't come. And so, I mean, it's a very common illness. I'm told actually that the reason that the word is worth talking about is because the American Psychiatry Association says that 9 out of 10 people will suffer some form of lethologica sometime during their lives. And so it would be odd if most of us who use words didn't sometimes struggle for a word.
There we go. The larger the vocabulary, the greater the fall. A slightly more serious question here. So Rishi Kant asks, let me read out this question. There's a debate on the importance of English in India. Marginalized communities inspired by Dr. Ambedkar see English as a route for upliftment, whereas there's also a narrative of indigenous languages dying out with the number of speakers dwindling. How can one draw a middle line here? So this builds a little bit on what you were talking about earlier about the role of English in Indian contemporary politics, but maybe you could say a little about that.
Yeah, well, actually, yes, I partly addressed it in that, but not fully, because Rishi, your questioner actually raises an important issue, which is that Ambedkar, for example, deliberately dressed in Western suits and ties and spoke and wrote in English because he found it a way of empowerment for himself and his people. Those people in those days used to be called Dalit community, and he did it because he said that English didn't carry the trappings of caste and discrimination and all the archaic forms and failings of traditional Indian languages. It was very similar to his rejection of Mahatma Gandhi's insistence on idealized, self-sufficient village republics. Because Ambedkar said these villages are dens of iniquity, they're sinks of discrimination and hostility. I will not want India to be reduced to a village or a collection of villages. I want urbanization. I want English. And indeed, some of his sort of political descendants have now said we want capitalism because capitalism empowers Dalits. We don't want handouts from the upper caste. So there's a whole movement saying that we should take up English. There is in parallel a different movement that says We need English because English is the language of globalization, that you cannot function in a world economy today without having to deal with customers, consumers, and so on in English, not because it's their first language, it may be their second or their third language. But if you have English as a second or third language, it gives you something in common with a German customer or a Swede or a Chinese whom you want to do business with. So in this kind of world that's more knit together, it is rather necessary, one would suggest, to be able to have some command of English. And there's been a very interesting phenomenon of parents from very poor families taking their children out of government schools, which are essentially almost free, and putting them in hopeless private schools only because those private schools offer instruction in the English medium. So my answer to your questioner is that I think English is not just something that English speakers like myself want to cling on to. It is a language of aspiration. It's a language of empowerment. It's a language of national unity. And it's a language that gives opportunities to people who currently feel oppressed within the confines and the ethos of their mother tongues or local languages. So everyone knows I'm not a fan of British colonialism, but I'm very glad that Indians latched onto the English language and made of it what it is today. And I, as a proud Indian, want to see us holding on to the advantages that has given us.
Very good. We got a couple more minutes, so let's do a couple more questions quickly. Gopa Roy asks, have you noticed more words or expressions being adopted into Indian English from American English, overtaking British English? This is
yes, that's a very good.
But is this true?
It is true, James. You'll find Indians talking about apartment rather than flat, and elevator. It's partly, of course, media, because when you come across these words in movies and books and music and now on the internet, you think of them as the right word to use. No, I shouldn't say most, because that's a very unscientific way of putting it, but a surprisingly large number of Indians say schedule rather than schedule, because they hear schedule far more often in their workplaces. And so, but we don't have autumn, so we haven't gotten to the autumn-fall category of debate. But otherwise, yes, I would say a lot of American words are coming in like that, and stealing a march on English. England has given us our archaisms. So there's still people of a certain generation who'll tell you that some place you're looking for is a couple of furlongs down the road. And I don't think the English use furlong anymore, which is 2/8 of a mile. But the fact is that we in India still have people using it. But we don't, for example, have many Indians saying gotten as the Americans do for have got. Gotten is not completely absent. Once in a while I hear Indians saying gotten. And the other interesting development, somewhat dismaying, I think, because I'm a bit more of a purist when it comes to spelling, is that American spellings have now found acceptance in Indian English. And I used to write a column for ndtv.com once, and was horrified when they corrected my Indian English spellings, which are British derived, through an American spell check. And I said, this is wrong, this is American. And they said American is fine with us. So, yes, it is a battle that may be in the process of being lost.
We've got 1 minute to go, so I'm going to squeeze in two very quick questions. So Roshni Bangara asks, can we now have some big words of appreciation for the audience watching today? And Priya asks, if you had a word for today or a word of the day, what would it be for today? So let's have a few Tharoorosaurus specials to end in our final minute.
Well, actually, Penguin has been cleverly marketing the book by saying to the audience and others like you listening in you can put aside your hippopotamonstrosesquipedaliophobia, which means a fear of long words. So with this book, you can indeed put aside your fear of long words. I want to assure you, using another word from Tharoorosaurus, that there's a lot of hyperbole about when it comes to my excessive fondness for long words. But you too can be an opsimath. and learn a few new ones, even if you're of advanced age. I think those would be 3 words from the book I've tossed into one sentence. If you really want a word of the day, it would have to be one of the words in my reply to Chetan Bhagat, I think, which while we were talking has crossed almost 32,000 likes on Twitter. And of those, I would certainly hope that limpid perspicacity might actually be something that most writers would want to be capable of. James certainly is, and I commend his book to you. He's been very modest in playing foil to me and not talking about his own writing. But I can assure you that limpid perspicacity comes through in James's writing a lot.
That's very kind of you. All right, so Shashi Tharoor, a man never known to suffer, even if he claims he does, from lethologica, a lover of knowledge, which if you read the book, you'll find out is epistemophilia. Shashi, thank you very much for that. Much appreciated. I hope the book goes on to great success. And let me hand now back to Sanjoy to say a few words to close.
Thank you so much, James Crabtree. Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor. And I suspect every spelling bee person has got hold of your book. It's going to race up the charts in the United States, if nothing else. But brilliant as usual. And thank you for stealing away from your parliamentary meeting this evening to be with us on JLF at London British Library. Unfortunately, we couldn't take you there in flesh and blood, but we promised to do so in 2021. Thank you, James, for joining us from Singapore, and thank you all for watching as usual. Please stay on for our next session. And before that, please do consider donating to help us bridge the financial gap. The JLF London at the British Library, which is free to view by clicking on the link below, and also support the British Library by donating to support.bl.uk. Our next session will be The Dharma of the Storyteller, Reflections on the Writing Life, Amish Tripathi, Vikas Swarup, and Shrabani Basu in conversation. And now we present a reading from the Jaipur Writer Short series featuring writer Shrabani Basu.
Hello everybody, I'll read a little passage to you from Spy Princess. This is from the night Noor leaves on her last mission. On the afternoon of 16th June, Vera Atkins called for Noor at Orchard Court in an open car. They drove through the Sussex countryside in full summer bloom with honeysuckle and marguerites. Noor hardly said a word. Vera Atkins noticed she had a serene expression on her face and a half smile playing on her lips. It was nearly evening by the time they reached Tangmere in Sussex and stopped outside the little ivy-covered cottage just opposite the main gates of the RAF station. It was partly hidden by tall hedges and could hardly be seen from the road. Though it was a summer evening, all the doors and windows were shut and the silence was almost eerie. But as the two women stepped inside, they found the hall was full of smoke and they could hear men's voices. After a hearty farewell supper, Vera Atkins led Noor upstairs to her room. Noor started to get ready, putting on her green oilskin coat. In her handbag was a French identity card, ration card, and her Webley pistol. The rest of her belongings, radio, clothes, and personal effects, would be parachuted separately, so she did not have to carry them with her. Carrying the pistol was a precautionary step in case they were ambushed as soon as they landed. Vera Atkins did the usual last-minute pocket check for English cigarettes, English bus tickets, or English money, anything that could risk the agent's life if discovered. As she was getting ready, Noor noticed a silver bird on Vera Atkins' suit and remarked how lovely it was and how Vera always managed to look so smart. She herself, she felt, inevitably looked plain. The older woman took off the bird and pinned it on Noor's lapel. When Noor protested, she said, "It's a little bird. It will bring you luck." Soon there was a knock on the door signaling that it was time to go. The full moon shone high in the sky. A large Ford estate car was waiting to take them to the airstrip. There, silhouetted against the night sky, they could see the two Lysanders waiting for their passengers. Noor stepped out into the night and walked on English soil for the last time. She felt she was keeping her promise to the people of France. She was going back. In France that evening, waiting agents received a message on the BBC French service. It said, "Jasmine is playing her flute." It was the code telling them that Noor was coming.